untrue. Hello, good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good whatever time of night or day it happens to be, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to Republic News. I'm your hostess, Liviana. As is so often the case, this installment of Republic News will be another opinion, editorial, or op-ed. In this installment of Republic News, I will be discussing a bit of history and the history of thought and how it relates to certain current social phenomena. This is the second video in the series of the historical context of postmodernist outrage mongers or post-structuralist outrage mongers. In this evening's, or whatever time of day it happens to be wherever you are, in this installment, anyway, of Republic News, I will be discussing Calvinism and how it relates to the post-structuralist outrage monger culture. In the first video in this series, I discussed Puritanism as a sort of historical predecessor of postmodernist outrage monger culture, and it just so happens that Puritanism is a Calvinistic manifestation. The Calvinists got together at the Council of Dort, and they came up with what they called 5 points of Calvinism. So these doctrines which they came up with, the 5 points of Calvinism, each one of them starts with a letter, and the starting letter of each of the doctrines spells out the word tulip. So the first of the doctrines is total depravity. The second one is unconditional election. The third one is limited atonement. The fourth one is irresistible grace. And the fifth one is perseverance of saints. So now, what do these doctrines actually mean? Okay, so before I go into the doctrines themselves, I would like to make a little comment about the Council of Dort. It's also known as the Synod of Dort, or the Synod of Dordrecht. And it was held in Dordrecht in what is now the Netherlands in the years 1618 to 1619 by the Dutch Reformed Church, with meetings of Reformed theologians and ministers from throughout Europe and Britain. Anyway, we'll just say that, Britain, Great Britain. So there are some within the Reformed tradition who would tell you that the 5 points of Calvinism, as defined by the Synod of Dordrecht, or Dort, are representative of what is known as hyper-Calvinism. And they then try to distinguish themselves from what they call hyper-Calvinists in relation to the 5 points of Calvinism. So there is some slight difference of interpretation of these doctrines. So I'm just going to be telling you what I remember from my undergraduate years when I was studying religion. So we will talk about first the first doctrine listed, which is the total depravity. And basically what this means, and it's a hereditary thing, it's this sinful nature which has supposedly been inherited from Adam, who committed the first sin. According to the writings attributed to Paul, Eve did not sin because she was deceived, but Adam supposedly knew better and went ahead and did anyway, and therefore he was the first one to sin. So, according to this doctrine of total depravity, humans are dead in sin and therefore can do nothing. They cannot choose to be saved. They cannot choose to convert to Christianity. And so if you're dead, you can't do anything, right? So your will is also depraved. You cannot will to become a Christian. So if this be the case, then God must do everything. And therefore God, we move on to the next doctrine here, predestinates some to salvation and some to perdition. That is correct. Predestinates, not predestines. And this predestinate unconditional election or unconditional choice made on the basis of nothing whatsoever. It's not based on foreknowledge that you would have been saved. It's not based on anything at all. It's just supposedly grace, which according to most theologians, charis, the Greek word, translates to grace, and it means basically undeserved love or favor on the part of the Christian God toward a human. And so, for no reason whatsoever, the Christian God supposedly picked out a few people to predestinate to salvation and others to predestinate to perdition. Now, perdition means damnation. It means hell. It means eternal punishment and so forth. So there you have that. So there's the doctrine of unconditional election. So then the next part of the next one of the doctrines is irresistible grace. And what that means is basically when the Holy Spirit acts upon one of the elect, one of those who are predestinated to salvation, that person is incapable of resisting the call of the Spirit. The next one is I skipped ahead. I'm sorry. Limited atonement means that Jesus' life or death or both atoned only for those who were already elect. So only those who were predestinated to salvation would be atoned for by the whatever means Jesus supposedly atoned for sin and the like. There are many doctrines about this. I mean, there's the Abelardian view, which I think is probably pretty interesting, which is basically that it wasn't the death of Jesus which atoned for sin, but rather Jesus' life, and insofar as his death was part of his life, that too. But it was because Jesus fulfilled the law, the Torah, which according to the writings attributed to Paul are impossible for any ordinary human to fulfill, to keep perfectly. And this is one of the reasons why all have sinned according to the Pauline literature. So then you come to irresistible grace, which is when the Holy Spirit moves upon a person who is predestinated to salvation, they can't resist. They become saved. And the final one is the perseverance of the saints. And what that means, to quote exactly, the true saint will always persevere in grace. And that has become somewhat distorted into a more simplified doctrine among some Baptists, the Calvinistic missionary Baptists and Calvinistic anti-missionary Baptists, such as the Southern Baptist Convention, which is a Calvinistic missionary Baptist group or sect. And that, according to them, they call it the security of the believer, which is once saved, always saved. But the original doctrine formulated at the Council or Synod of Dort or Dordrecht, was the perseverance of saints. The true saint will always persevere in grace. So, those are the 5 points of Calvinism. So according to this doctrine of total depravity, as I've said, the human is hereditarily completely corrupt, completely depraved. Every part of the human being, including the reason and the will and the passion, everything that makes up a human being is completely depraved. And among other things, that means that humans are a source of wickedness in the world. And so you find this reflected in Puritanism later, which, as I said, is a manifestation of a type of Puritanism, with the kind of attitude you find reflected in the story of Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, as I have mentioned in the first video in this series, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, the idea is that Young Goodman Brown goes out into the wilderness where he has some kind of experience, and when he comes back, he from that point on judges everyone as well as himself to be completely wicked and hypocritical and wearing a false mask of piety. which is a very interesting turn of phrase. So you find much later in Gerhard Ebeling, a German theologian, who said that the faith which refuses to think is unbelief hiding behind a mask of piety. But that's something for another time. But anyway, let's see here. Okay, so to relate this to the postmodernist outrage mongers or post-structuralist outrage mongers, we need to look at the attitudes of these people toward other people. So what we have with the so-called social justice warrior or postmodernist outrage monger or post-structuralist outrage monger or whatever you would really like to refer to them as, basically they have a sort of superiority thing where they look down their noses at those whom they believe to be privileged. And so for them, the cisgender, heterosexual, white male is the most inferior kind of human who could possibly exist. And so they have what they call the progressive stack. And the only thing progressive about it is that it progresses from a sort of less oppressed to higher oppressed or more oppressed group or demographic or whatever. So what you have there is this kind of, the progressive stack is used to determine who is going to be allowed to speak and in what order. So those who are supposedly the most oppressed are the ones who get to speak first. What you have with this then is the development of what has been described as oppression Olympics and victim complexes or playing victim, which is one of the defense mechanisms of the ego. It's a game described by Eric Berne in his classic book, Games People Play. And it is a Freudian defense mechanism of the ego. It is also sometimes referred to as damaged personality disorder. And what this is the self-defined victim who may in fact have been subjected to some kind of abuse in the past, but this abuse then continues in a cycle where the abused becomes the abuser, and so will accuse usually someone close to them, someone with whom they've had some kind of dealings, or some kind of more or less intimate relationship, of being the abuser, and they proceed to engage in telling all manner of tales about this person behind their back and smearing their reputation and making them out to be the bad guy, the boogeyman, basically. And so you have this whole victim routine that goes on then. So, I mean, I could give you some examples, but don't want to get sued. The idea basically is that this kind of, by virtue of having been born into privilege, someone is therefore incapable of being other than sexist and racist and homophobic and transphobic and so forth. And it's really quite astonishing to encounter some of these claims. So to reiterate what I have been talking about, we have in this post-structuralist outrage monger culture the belief that all cisgender heterosexual white males are somehow inherently genetically or hereditarily corrupt, depraved. That, for example, a white person cannot ever be free of privilege, cannot ever be someone who does not benefit from white supremacy, and therefore is someone who, in fact, supports white supremacy, which is, of course, absolutely ludicrous when you consider the fact that a white poor person and a black poor person have more in common than either one of them does with a rich person of any skin color or ethnicity. It becomes rather obvious that this notion is ridiculous. The idea that every male is somehow a rapist or a potential rapist, whether they've ever even considered or contemplated raping anyone, that all men are misogynistic and chauvinistic and sexist. And those three terms are often used as if they were synonymous, and they are not. You may have occasionally the gay white male, cisgender gay white male, accepted as somehow not quite as bad because he has been subject to some kind of oppression or persecution by virtue of being gay. Then, however, you also have some of these extremists who will say things like, a gay man who doesn't want to have sex with a woman simply because she has a vagina, that's discrimination, and what the hell? What? No, it's not, okay? So a cisgender, heterosexual white male who doesn't want to have sex with a trans woman, that's somehow discrimination, in spite of the fact that they don't distinguish between post-op and pre-op transsexuals. So they're saying, well, you don't want to have sex with me because you're a transphobe. Well, in reality, the man may simply not have any orientation towards penis, That's not transphobic. That's just being heterosexual. Now, at the same time, when it comes to a post-op transsexual, yeah, maybe there is some transphobia involved there if the man does not want to engage in sexual activity with a post-op trans woman. But again, there are other factors which need to be considered, such as the possibility that the man wants to have children of his own, children born of his own seed, if you will. And certainly that would not be possible with a trans woman unless she had an ovary and a uterus transplanted into herself, which is an extremely expensive and extremely risky surgery. It has been done before, but often the transplanted organs are rejected, and that can cause severe challenges and possibly even death. So it's not necessarily transphobic if a cisgender heterosexual white male does not want to engage in a relationship with a trans woman. And speaking of trans women, there's another example of some of the most irrational behavior on the part of these post-structuralist outrage mongers, which is the idea that because a person was born with male chromosomes, that person is necessarily male. This is a denial of the scientific evidence, which shows that there is a difference in brains between those who are male and female, and that also includes trans women who have a brain more like that of a cisgender woman than they do like that of a cisgender man. The only sometimes overlap is when it comes to stimulus response. You will find that trans women may have similar responses to certain stimuli as gay men, but also the same as cisgender heterosexual women. So there's that. But then you have these people who are called TERFs. TERF is an acronym. It stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. And these people insist that gender is a totally socially constructed concept. Now, this is due in part to a confusion of the word gender because it is ambiguous. It actually refers to three distinct things: gender identity, gender roles, and gender expression. Gender identity is inherent. A person is born with a gender identity by virtue of a hormone wash of the brain in utero. So it doesn't always correspond with the chromosomal sex of the fetus. Now, in the vast majority of cases, yes, it does, but not always. No one is really sure yet why this happens occasionally, but happen it does. And that identity then is not consistent with the chromosomal sex. So you can have a person with XY chromosomes who has a female brain gender, or you can have a person with XX chromosomes who has a male brain gender. So, and these people would not consider the oppression or the persecution that such a person might have endured, and will still instead insist that this person is male and will always be male, that they are a man, and they will always be a man, no matter how much plastic surgery they have, no matter what kind of hormones or testosterone blockers they take, and so forth and so on. And it seems to be, and I'm not entirely certain of this because I haven't taken a survey of everyone involved in the TERF movement, but seems to me that a large number of these people are what are known as dyke lesbians. And I'm not using dyke as a pejorative. It's a type of lesbian, as lipstick lesbian or femme lesbian. There are various types of lesbians, essentially, just as there are various types of gay men. So you have your butch, you have your Mary, and you have your fairy queen, and so forth and so on. I don't know all these terms because it's not something that I have delved deeply into, but there are different types of people regardless of sexual orientation. In other words, not everyone is identical in every way. Not every gay man is like every other gay man, not every lesbian is like every other lesbian, and so forth and so on. This should be obvious, because not every straight person is exactly like every other straight person. There are a number of different dimensions involved in performance of gender and preference when it comes to sexual orientation and so forth. But anyway, so according to these TERFs, a trans woman will always be male and therefore will always benefit from male privilege and will always have some kind of inherent misogyny and sexism and chauvinism and the like. This is something that I just really can't wrap my head around because, I have been around fundamentalists before, and that's what these people are. They are science-denying fundamentalists. They have bought into this idea that gender, by which they mean all three things and not simply one, is completely a social construct, and therefore they engage in confirmation bias. They accept only, they cherry pick the evidence so that they will accept only the evidence which supports this perspective and ignore any evidence which suggests that it might not be true. So then, according to these people, because of the accident of birth and purely based on chromosomes alone, not considering any evidence about brain gender or the like, that person will always be and cannot change in any way this kind of whatever kind of depravity they would be talking about. A lot of these women are, it seems, rather paranoid that a trans woman wants to come into female-only spaces in order to be pervy. And they also seem to have the idea that all trans women are somehow attracted to women, which is not necessarily the case. Again, transsexuality has nothing whatsoever to do with sexual orientation. A trans woman may prefer men, she may prefer women, she may prefer men or women. A trans person can be gay, straight, or bi. But anyway, the point to this is that there is this example of total depravity again. So again, cisgender, heterosexual, white male is doomed and damned no matter what, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's inherent and inherited. So they are innately corrupt and depraved, if you will. Now, as far as unconditional election, that doesn't really come into this so much in the sense that a lot of these people don't believe in any kind of higher power, and so there's no concept of predestination or an afterlife or the like. But at any rate, what we're talking about here is still nevertheless sort of unconditional election, because they're talking about a person is predestinated to being a white supremacist and a misogynist and a transphobe and a homophobe simply by virtue of the accident of birth, whereas other people, say a transgender lesbian black female, would automatically be better than anybody else because of the accident of birth, because she has been subjected to persecution. and is more oppressed than anyone else, supposedly. I don't really know how you can measure oppression, who's more oppressed than someone else and the like, but I mean, certainly Native Americans have suffered quite a lot. So, I mean, there's that to be considered as well. But how do you decide, on what basis do you decide who is the most oppressed, and therefore who gets to speak first and who has to wait till last, if they even still have time to speak in the event? It's not something I think is clearly spelled out, and I don't really know of any objective way to measure oppression or persecution. So then we come to limited atonement, and again, there's such a prevalence of atheism among these people that they don't necessarily have any view of atonement in terms of supernatural or spiritual, or however you want to, a religious sort of atonement. But as far as the cisgender or heterosexual white male, there's no atonement. There's nothing he can possibly do that would make him okay. Now, you have some you have some male feminists or male feminist allies. In my experience, and I'm a little older than some of you who watch my channel, so I've had several decades to experience life and observe people. And I learned rather early in life, in my early adulthood, that very often when a man seems to be espousing the rhetoric of feminism, he's a guy that you want to be wary of, because it seems like very often, and certainly recent history has borne this out, a lot of these guys are simply doing this as a performance, as an act. They are acting, and they're doing so in order to try to get in your pants. So, be careful, because they may not be what they seem to be. But now, me saying that does not mean in any way that a man cannot be a good man. If you have any doubts about this, you can see the video I did recently called Non-Toxic Masculinity, wherein I discuss what is toxic masculinity and what is deep masculinity, or non-toxic masculinity, as I called it. Both of these terms come not from feminism, but from the mythopoetic men's movement. So let's see now. The next one would be irresistible grace. Now, there's no grace. There's nothing. There's no way for this person to be made acceptable or good or anything of the sort. They will always be cisgender heterosexual white males, and therefore they will always be depraved, according to these outrage mongers. And then we come to perseverance of the saints, which is sort of a non-starter, because the person who is born into one of these oppressed classes can never get out of that oppressed class, so to speak, theoretically. Now, eventually, ideally, what these activists say they would like to see is equality across the board, but they don't seem to have any clear idea of how to get there. But going back to the so-called unconditional election, we do have this sort of attitude of superiority, this sort of in-group thing that goes on, just as you would have within any type of Calvinistic religious manifestation, including Puritanism, which I've discussed previously. So you have this idea of the elect being superior because they are elect, and it's not through any fault or merit of their own. It's simply that they have been chosen for no reason whatsoever, and therefore they can feel secure, and they typically do look down their noses on the unelect, or those who are elect to perdition, those who are damned by virtue of nothing whatsoever except, well, in the case of the postmodernist or post-structuralist outrage mongers, it's purely the accident of birth. So again, A male will always be a male. A white man will always be a white person. Will always be white. A cisgender person will always be cisgender, and a heterosexual person will always be heterosexual. And there's nothing they can do about that. And that is true. Okay, that much is true. You cannot change any of those things. Those are inherent characteristics of a person, at least not with any kind of technology we have today. Now, it is, of course, possible to have gender-confirming surgery and to take hormone blockers and hormones which correspond to one's gender identity, and therefore become more externally like what one is on the inside, in the brain, in the mind. And so there is such a thing as a trans woman or a trans man, someone who has changed their external appearance, have changed their external sexual characteristics, changed their gender expression, and adopted different gender roles. So there is that, but again, we do have these TERF people who can't accept that because it doesn't jibe with their dogma. But anyway, so I think I have done a fairly good job here of discussing how Calvinism is a sort of historical predecessor to postmodernist outrage mongers, or post-structuralist outrage mongers, or, if you wish, social justice warriors. I don't like that term because they are not about social justice. And there are some sources which will claim that this was originally a term of praise, social justice warrior, but it wasn't. In fact, it was invented as a term of mockery because these were keyboard warriors, and that's where the warrior part came from. And most of them don't seem to care that much about social justice at all. They seem more interested in their egos and elevating themselves, getting social justice points by virtue signaling and so forth. But anyway, as I said, I think I've done a fairly good job here of a fairly thorough job of describing the similarities between Calvinism and so-called outrage culture. I'm not really sure where I'm going from here. I do have quite a bit of material already done, researched and prepared, and the original video recording that I did for this series was over 2 hours long. So I do have another hour at least of material that I will need to go back over and see how I can rephrase it and put it together in a way that will give me at least 2, maybe 3 more videos in this series. There's certainly quite a bit more to cover. I mean, I will be talking about what social justice actually is, and I will also be talking about various types of dualism going all the way back to the Persian Zoroastrians, or followers of Zarathustra, who were the first dualists. And dualism is very definitely an aspect of this, because there is this kind of in-group, out-group. There's the demonization of everyone who is not in the club, so to speak. These people who are, again, cisgender, heterosexual white males, they are to be regarded as, the other, and demonized consequently. But anyway, like I said, this is all I have for this particular installment. So I'm going to go ahead and beam up here and warp out. And until next time, have fun, but stay safe.